Chapter 18: The Real Epidemic, an Outbreak of Modern Amnesia. Anyone at all familiar with Egyptian-Hebrew relations in antiquity knows that pre-20th century scholars have utterly nothing of significance to say about that period. In the course of my first 7 years of research, I had looked at several hundred books and articles by 20th century scholars, and virtually none had alluded to the work of their predecessors of the 19th century, much less of the centuries before that. I say virtually because of very few exceptions. The main one is Bernard Stade's frequently cited article distinguishing B2 from B1 that was published towards the 19th century's close. Until I had nearly finished the research of this book, I had shared the general assumption that today's scholarship, for all its weaknesses, has nothing to learn from the pre-modern era, a time when archaeological discoveries were few and when, as I believed, methodological primitivism, racial intolerance, and religious dogmatism were widespread. Then one evening, paying what I thought would be a final visit to the McGill University's main library, I chanced upon a leather-bound book so old as to make me wonder what it was doing there. Fingering its dried-out pages, I found it had been published at Oxford in 1838 and written by one A.H.L. Heeren. The volume, which was translated from German, bore a tedious title: Historical Researches into the Politics, Intercourse, and Trade of the Carthaginians, Ethiopians, and Egyptians. Idly leafing through it, I was immediately struck by the extraordinary tone when describing Kush/Meroe/Ethiopia. It was one of respect. In the course of his surprisingly detailed 150-page treatment of the ancient culture, Heeren speaks of the luster of the Ethiopians in Greek literature. He observes how in his own day they continued to command admiration. Indeed, the German says the pen of cautious, clear-sighted historians often places them in the highest rank of knowledge and civilization. Heeren praises the piety and justice of the Ethiopians and goes on to deduce that they are the first virtues which would be cultivated in a nation whose government was established by religion and commerce and not by violence and oppression. Amazing. I kept reading, compelled to see what conclusions this open-minded approach might produce when tackling the crisis of 701 BC. It turned out that Heeren devotes just one sentence to the conflict, but that sentence is even more stunning. Taharqa was a contemporary of Sennacherib and deterred him from the invasion of Egypt merely by the rumor of his advance against him. In one pithy sentence, Heeren says it all, that the 25th dynasty's expedition was exclusively responsible for turning back Sennacherib. He also implies that in challenging Assyria, the dynasty was not engaging in imperialistic meddling, but rather in self-defense against the invasion of Egypt. The lone sentence also contains something that is just as surprising, but more subtle, an offhand manner. It seems to hint that no further elaboration is necessary. Could it be, I wondered, that the expedition's successful outcome was in Heeren's pre-industrial Europe, common knowledge? If so, I knew my research would be far from over. It would take on a new puzzle, and as unsettling to me as it was intriguing. No longer would there just be the one question to answer: what saves Jerusalem? There would be also a compelling follow-up question. Having once known the answer, why has the West lost it? Heeren, it turns out, was no eccentric writer whose views stood outside mainstream contemporary thinking. Born in Bremen in 1760, he was an establishment academic of the First Order. For his illustrious career as a historian and professor of philosophy at the University of Göttingen, King William IV of England knighted him, and King Louis Philippe of France made him a member of France's Legion of Honor. How common was Heeren's opinion that the 25th dynasty had played a big role in 701? To the sentence about Taharqa, Heeren's translator attaches a footnote. It refers the reader to Mott's Bible, an 1817 edition of the Bible, prepared by the Reverend Richard Mott and the Reverend George Deoli, both chaplains to the Archbishop of Canterbury, contains commentaries by earlier experts. In a note to 2 Kings 19:7, Chapter 19, verse 7, these editors cite one Bishop Patrick as subscribing to the idea that the pestilence had weakened Sennacherib. But they go on to quote Patrick as saying this about Isaiah's prophecy of a report. Perhaps after the pestilential stroke, the report was renewed that Taharka was coming against him, i.e. Sennacherib, which made him hasten away with the remains of his army to his own country. This espousal of a joint epidemic/Cushite rescue solution, with the Cushites getting credit for the coup de grace, is not whispered in the fine print of an obscure publication where only a few other specialized scholars will see it. On the contrary, the information could hardly be more prominent. It is published in a widely circulated edition of the Old Testament that says the title page is for the use of families, and for other clergy and lay people alike. The source could not be more impeccable. The editors were members of the official entourage of the Church of England's highest cleric. As for the bishop himself, Simon Patrick, he was a staunch mainstream figure in Anglican circles. Born in 1626, he was a bishop of Ely, near Cambridge. Early in his career, he was, in the words of church history, among the great London preachers of his time. In his original commentary, published in 1705, Patrick says that two countries are called Cush, one known as Ethiopia and the other located in Arabia. For logistical rather than racial reasons, the prelate ops for the Arabian Cush, it was near, says Patrick, observing that the far-off Ethiopian monarch would have had to take his army through Egypt before he could fight with Sennacherib. In a posthumous edition of Patrick's commentary, however, this view changes, published in 1730 and edited by another Anglican cleric, William Lowth, 1160 to 1732, chaplain to the Bishop of Winchester. This edition comes out squarely in favor of an African location for Cush. Lowth sees merit in the idea that Taharka's army created a diversion for Sennacherib's forces just when they were ready to fall upon the Jews. It is plain, in other words, that in early 18th century England, it was quite respectable to believe that Africa played a significant role in saving Jerusalem. The legitimacy of this view goes back further still. One of the most influential figures in the Protestant Reformation was, of course, French theologian John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. The austere preacher is best remembered for having organized in the city-state of Geneva a theocratic government that enforced the biblical ideals of morality. In reading bits of his extensive analysis of the Bible, it is hard not to be impressed by the breadth of his learning, even by today's standards. The founder of the University of Geneva saw such theological significance in the events of 701 that he devoted fully 70 pages to them in his commentary on the book of Isaiah. That text makes for an astonishing read. The author shows an understanding of the politics behind the conflict of 701 that is, in my opinion, far more penetrating than that of any modern scholar. It says much about the aptitude of our age that Calvin was able to put together that analysis on the basis of data that was much more meager than what is available today. He relied on the Hebrew Bible and Herodotus only, the discovery of the Assyrian annals and the emergence of Egyptology, which, with P.A. Stella and other findings, showed the Cushites' military heft were still centuries away. According to Calvin's analysis, Egypt and Cush became politically linked for the specific purpose of opposing Sennacherib. They saw that his power was becoming excessive and that his invasion of other countries had no limit. In his broad-minded view, Cush and Egypt acted wisely in joining their forces and meeting him early, for separately they would easily have been subdued and destroyed. The Cushite monarch's involvement in Egypt and his later intervention in Judah were, for him, part of a defensive strategy against Assyria. By consolidating their military forces, Egypt and Cush could repel the power and violence of that tyrant. The 25th dynasty's involvement in Kor, then, was a sensible, preemptive strike against the tyrant, Sennacherib, not a foolish attempt at self-aggrandizement. The analysis is brilliant. Calvin's analysis of the actual conflict of 701 is less so. Theology gets in his way. Assyria's reversal, he suggests, came in two stages. First, he says that the report of Taharka's approach compelled Sennacherib to withdraw from Jerusalem, taking Herodotus at face value. Calvin goes on to say that Sennacherib might have marched to Pelusium in Egypt, where he became entangled in a hazardous war against Egypt. The second stage occurred when, after retreating from Pelusium, Sennacherib went back to Judah, feeling ashamed of having failed in his first siege of Jerusalem. The Syrian king sought to attack the city a second time. Before he could do so, the angel struck, causing Sennacherib to return home. The angel, Calvin insists, was real and not a mere metaphor for a disease. The idea that a plague was responsible is, for him, nothing less than the invention by which Satan, through profane historians, has attempted to obscure this extraordinary judgment of God. He refrains from speculating on how, if not via disease, the deity achieved victory. While Egypt's army did give some relief to the Jews, for Calvin it would have been unfitting for the hand of man or natural causes such as disease to deliver the decisive blow against the invaders. For this subscriber to the Deuteronomic thought, the angelic role means that all the praise is due to God alone, of whom the angels are only instruments. Still, in his treatment of the Pharaoh's forces, Calvin is generous, crediting them with driving off Sennacherib twice, once by the report of their advance, and the second time by the force of arms at Pelusium. At least as far back as the 16th century, then some Christians espouse the idea that Cush of Egypt played a critical role, the supporting role, in an event whose importance was for them theologically monumentous. By the 19th century, one finds a willingness to credit Cushite Egypt with having played the leading role. The Cushite rescue theory attracts many supporters besides Hiren. For example, in the Imperial Bible Dictionary, a massive reference volume published in London in 1867, the Reverend Harry Constable of Cork says that Taharka achieved a midnight overthrow of Sennacherib. And in this 1878 edition of this three-volume study of ancient Egypt, the vice president of the British Archaeological Association, Sir J. Gardner Wilkinson, refers unequivocally to Taharka's successful opposition to the power of Assyria in Judah. Wilkinson, who first visited Egypt in 1821 and was one of the founders of the British Egyptology, credits Taharka with the defeat of the numerous army of Sennacherib. Adding authority to this view is the fact that, according to the title page, this edition of Wilkinson's famous work was revised and corrected by Samuel Birch, a luminary in the field who carried the important titles of Keeper of the Egyptian and Oriental Antiquities in the British Museum, President of the Society of Biblical Archaeology. One illustrious Western thinker of that time was Heinrich von Ewald, 1803 to 1875, who Britannica describes as one of the foremost Christian theologians of the 19th century Germany. He does not give exclusive credit to Taharka, preferring to ascribe Sennacherib's wild flight to a combination of terror at the approach of the Ethiopian army and a desolating plague. Nonetheless, Ewald, who taught at the University of Göttingen a generation after Hiren, cast a positive light on the 25th dynasty's diplomatic dealing with Judah prior to the invasion. The powerful Ethiopian king, he says approvingly, sent a solemn embassy to Jerusalem in this period of Judite depression to proffer friendship and assistance. There is nothing about a wielding 25th dynasty provoking rebellion. In Jewish circles, we encounter the same sort of thinking. Important rabbinic commentators of past centuries credit Taharka with a vital role in causing Sennacherib's departure. In giving these two commentators' views, I am quoting from a 1980 annotation of 2 Kings by Rabbi A.J. Rosenberg. Adak, subscript 22, approximately 1160 to 1235, a rabbi from France, the words, "and he will return to his land," 2 Kings, chapter 19, verse 7, refer to Sennacherib's return to Assyria to defend it against Tirharka, king of Cush. Radak's scenario may be highly imaginative, calling for Taharka to have launched a strike against Mesopotamia, yet the medieval rabbi still credits the Cushite with liberating Jerusalem. Malbim, 1809 to 1879, an Eastern European rabbi. Sennacherib's withdrawal from Jerusalem was itself a series of miracles. First, Sennacherib heard by a rumor, not an official report, that Jehoiakim had marched on Assyria, yet he believed it. Second, he returned to his land, taking the entire army with him. He did not leave any portion of his vast army to lay siege to Jerusalem. In the United States, one of the pioneers of Reform Judaism was Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, 1819 to 1900. He was the founding president of Hebrew Union College, the oldest rabbinical seminary in the United States, and he has been called one of the country's two most important Jewish religious leaders of his time. Wise, who was also a vigorous critic of the curse of Ham theory, was as a justification for American slavery, says Taharqa forced the Assyrian army's departure after disease had enfeebled it. The point then should be made emphatically. Prior to the 20th century, those who stated that the Cushite dynasty had played some sort of major role, whether supporting or leading, in turning back Sennacherib, included some of the West's leading figures in Christian and Jewish thought. This respectful view of Cush is a glowing display in the arts. Giuseppe Verdi's 1871 opera Aida is the best known example. Egypt's Ottoman viceroy commissioned the Italian composer to write the opera for the opening of a new Cairo opera house, and the eminent French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette helped write the scenario. The title character of this interracial love story, which immediately enjoyed huge popularity in Europe, is of course a Cushite slave in the Egyptian pharaoh's court. She and the Egyptian captain of the pharaoh's guard are in love. While the plot features an invasion of Egypt by the Cushite king, Verdi presents Cush as militarily competent and culturally respectable, and indeed the sympathetic Ida herself turns out to be the daughter of the Cushite king. It is significant that Mariette's regard for Cushites was shared by his earlier countryman, Jean-Francois Champollion, decipherer of Egyptian hieroglyphics, and perhaps most celebrated Egyptologist of all time. This historian and linguist who visited Nubia concluded in 1829, more than a century prior to the emergence of Afrocentrism, that Nubians had been the founders of pharaonic Egypt. Later, invaders, he said, were responsible for changing much of the population's physical appearance. Although he did not address the campaign of 701, Champollion had nothing but good things to say about the 25th dynasty. Its rule was gentle and humane. In sculpture and painting, too, European open-mindedness towards Africa flourished in the heart of the 19th century. In Paris's Musée d'Orsay, for example, stands a towering bronze statue made in 1872 of the four parts of the world holding up the globe. The allegory by Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, one of the leading sculptors of France's Second Empire, shows the planet lifted by four women, Caucasian, Amerindian, Oriental, and African. Each is noble and majestic. A few feet away is a bronze bust of the Sudanese Negro in a turban and piercing eyes. In the sculpture made in 1857 by Charles Cordier, the man looks at least as distinguished as any of the same aristocratic European subjects. Meanwhile, in England, much the same was occurring. The pre-Raphaelite artists are famous for their uplifting idealizations of figures from Greek myths and the Arthurian legends. But they did not limit their search of heroic figures to Europeans. In an imposing 12-foot high oil begun in 1881, the pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Brune Jones portrays a black African king clad in armor wooing a white maiden. A poem by Tennyson, based on an Elizabethan legend, inspired the scene. Burne-Jones presents the young man, King Cophetua, in an upright and lordly a manner, as in other paintings he depicts Perseus and Galahad. And then, suddenly, within a decade or two of Ida's triumphant debut, this sense of equity wilts. Respect for Africa makes way for disdain. This is not to suggest that before this time all European intellectuals regarded black Africans with a sense of fair play, nor that afterwards they all ceased to do so. But generally speaking, a societal sea change took place in both the arts and in scholarship. Among the generations of Egyptologists that succeeded Mariette 1821 to 1881, it's hard to imagine anyone capable of devising any Ida-like plot. As support for the Cushite rescue theory wanes, scholars' acceptance of rival theories surges. To be sure, these alternative theories did not arrive out of thin air. The epidemic theory, for example, had received approval from Josephus as early as the 1st century AD, and according to Calvin, it enjoyed some support in the 16th century. Lord Byron also seems to hint at the idea in his 1815 poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, and in 1853, a book by Nineveh's celebrated discoverer, Austin Layard, backed the notion. But now, in the late 19th century, alternatives to the Cushite rescue theory gain an unprecedented degree of acceptance. James Breasted, 1905's bestseller, with its ostensibly erudite reference to plague-infested winds and its insistence on the Nepotan pharaoh's inglorious rule, popularized this dismissive view of Cush by scoffing at the Cushites had become common well before then. In 1897, for example, one of the most popular of the English-speaking world's religious writers, Cunningham Geike of England, or Cunningham Geike of England, suggests that the conflict had disgraced the Cushites. After the El Teke clash, the Presbyterian minister said Taharqa had been hurled back ignominiously towards Egypt, thus leaving Hezekiah, so far as he was concerned, to fall into the hands of Assyria and Sennacherib's forces, his terrible foe. Message: Taharqa was not only a militarily weakling, but also, to save his skin, he unmanfully abandoned his helpless ally. As Stade himself in his 1886 article declared that the rumor of Taharqa's advances that had caused Sennacherib to depart was in fact a false rumor, an explanation that had the effect of nullifying Africa's true performance. One of the most famous of all the historians of the day was Leopold von Ranke, a religiously motivated German who is sometimes called the father of modern history writing. In the 1885 English edition of one of his books, The Devout Lutheran, who sought to juggle objectivity with a desire to show the truth of God's hand in history, endorsed the theory that the troubles elsewhere in the empire had drawn Sennacherib away. About this same time, many other internationally influential historians, often clerics or strongly religious laypeople, threw their weight behind the epidemic theory. Among these leading lights were Franz Dieltjes, a Christian intellectual at the University of Leipzig, Alfred Edersheim, the Oxford scholar and Presbyterian minister, and George Adam Smith, Scottish preacher and principal of the University of Aberdeen, who received the knighthood for his prolific biblical scholarship. Other examples abound. In 1908, it had become so de rigueur to diminish the Cushite rule at Jerusalem that in the biblical commentary, one William Emery Barnes went so far as to vilify Taharqa as Assyria's contemptible foe. The book could hardly have had more respectable credentials. The Cambridge University Press published it, and Barnes was a professor of divinity and associate of the Bishop of London. In 1910, a famous excavator of Kushite and Egyptian remains, George Reisner of Harvard and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, concluded of Kush, its very race appears to be a product of its poverty and its isolation, a Negro and Egyptian mixture fused together on a desert riverbank too far away and too poor to attract a stronger and better race. This has been a light sampling of scholarship from medieval times onwards, not a systematic review of it, but what it suggests is that in the course of the 1880s, two things happened. The tradition of writing that was supportive of Kushites tends to taper noticeably, soon to peter out, and writings that marginalize the Kushites' role at Jerusalem enter a boom period. Puzzled by this blizzard of Kushite demoting opinions starting in the decade of the 1880s, I opened some history books to see what might explain such a sea change. The ancient world was free, or relatively free, of what we today call racism. A major cause of racism's emergence was a rise as early as the 16th and 17th centuries of European colonialism. Yet slavery took place out of sight of Europe itself. There, the practice was largely frowned upon and the racist premise of European superiority more muted. Despite the energetic presence of many Englishmen in the African slave trade, for example, the law banned slavery in England itself. Many Western intellectuals and clerics, as noted, were not particularly hostile to the Kushites and were often quite positive. Indeed, in the 19th century, Europe's sympathy for Africans was on the upswing. In Britain, Parliament in 1833 abolished slavery in all British colonies. In 1848, France followed suit in its colonies. Why then this sudden arrival in the 1880s of antipathy towards Kush? Much of the answer has to do with the advent of this precise time of colonialism in Africa. The tumultuous process began late centuries after the conquest of the Americas and East Indies, and about a century after that of India. For an ideologically dispassionate view, here is Britannica. By the turn of the 20th century, the map of Africa looked like a huge jigsaw puzzle, with most of the boundary lines having been drawn in a sort of game of give and take played in the foreign offices of leading European powers. The division of Africa, the last continent to be carved up, was essentially a product of a new imperialism, vividly highlighting its essential features. In this respect, the timing and pace of the scramble for Africa was especially noteworthy. Before 1880, colonial possessions in Africa were relatively few and limited to coastal areas, with large sections of the coastline and almost all of the interior still independent. By 1900, Africa was almost entirely divided into separate territories controlled by European nations. Emphasis added. The turnaround in European assessment of the ancient Kushites then coincides almost perfectly with Europe's subjugation of all of Africa in the century's last 2 decades. As early as the mid-1800s, as early as the mid-1880s, the British press first dubbed the spirited process the scramble, and the name stuck. To be sure, colonialism was not the only cause of intensification of Western racism in the late 19th century. Ivan Hannaford's groundbreaking 1996 book, Race, The History of an Idea in the West, shows other influences. The British researcher says the publication in 1859 of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which introduced evidence of evolution, laid some of the intellectual groundwork for racism. Says Hannaford, if evolution and natural selection were the principles of natural existence and therefore applicable to social life, it may be true in the view of some of the Darwin's followers that the poor and Negro were in their natural condition because of some deficiency in their physical and intellectual capacity. Notable was the presence of the argument that the peoples living in simple ways were in such a state because of the original corruption of Ham or some scientific variant of it. In addition, says Hannaford, among the English in the second half of the 19th century, there arose a romantic consciousness of the spiritual force of race and scientific hereditism that both explained and justified the advance of Anglo-Saxon civilization in all corners of the world. By the century's end, the British Empire covered almost 1/4 of the world's land surface and was the home of more than 1/4 of the world's population. And other countries, Hannaford points out, other factors came into play. After France's defeat in 1879 in the Franco-Prussian War, for example, some of the country's influential writers, such as Edouard Drumont in a 1886 book, La France Juive, blamed Jewish financiers for victimizing the Aryan peoples of France. Hannaford deals with various precursor ideas to modern racism in the medieval and Renaissance period, including the Inquisition and other violent expressions of anti-Jewish feelings. Making a subtle distinction between anti-Jewish feeling and anti-Semitism, he finds that religion, as distinct from ethnic and racial considerations, largely determined the former. He says of the Inquisition and other early persecutions of Jews, because their idolatrous ways were seen as a threat to the true faith, their extirpation from the face of the earth could be justified. Drawing considerably on Hannah Arendt's analysis, Hannaford concludes that there was no fundamental historical movement of racial and anti-Semitic ideas until 1880. The observations certainly raise further questions about the historical evolution of these ideas and the nuances between the attitudes of various periods. But what's interesting is that Hannaford sees a watershed intensification of European hostility towards the other at precisely the same time that the Cushite rescue theory falls from grace. We begin to see, then, the kind of intellectual soil in which grew the trend towards minimizing and often disparaging the Cushites' place in history. It is easier for society to subjugate another if it convinces itself that the subjugated people are not just economically, but also morally inferior. A final thing is striking about the viewpoint that Hereen represents. It predates Stade's discovery of B1, B2 textual cleavage, That means pre-1880 thinkers often were able to discern Taharqa's decisive role without having the benefit of Stade's useful insight. When taking my first step in trying to discover what had happened to the Pharaoh's army in the territory that is now Israel, I repeatedly read the Second Kings account. I had a suspicion that Taharqa's army was a significant cause of Sennacherib's withdrawal, yet I did not trust my interpretation. Who was I asked myself, a rank novice reader of the Bible, to go against the prevailing opinion among experts? Only upon later learning of Stade's division of the main part of the narrative did I come to feel confident about the decisive role of Taharqa's army. The experts of the pre-modern era had firmly grasped the meaning that I had been fumbling towards. They did so without the help of Stade's breakthrough in textual analysis. That many people, such as Calvin, Hereen, Wise, and Wilkinson, had been able to penetrate the murky narrative prior to that sophisticated insight means two things. It demonstrates that the B2 writers did not erase the credit that the B1 writers would have given the Cushite Egypt's forces. Their theologically motivated insertion of the angel may have impeded a reader's view of the role of those forces, but it did not entirely block it. They may have rendered the deliverance stories historical denouement inconspicuous, but they had the integrity to leave it in. Second, the ability of early experts to reach such a conclusion without distinguishing between B1 and B2 fortifies the view that the Bible itself indicates Taharqa's army played a vital role in saving Jerusalem. It is an ironic coincidence that Stade's important paper should have been published in the same decade as the mass abandonment of the Cushite rescue theory. Logically, Stade's findings should have helped cement the case for Cushite's determining role. Its failure to do so, thanks to such feeble rationalizations as that the report of Taharqa's advance was false, shows the grip of Europe's colonial adventure on the thinking of serious historians. Intellectuals whom one might like to think of as too bright, too reflective, and especially among the larger numbers of those religiously inclined, too humanitarian as to vault so readily aboard a popular, narrow-minded bandwagon.